A young scholar named Jinhai arrived at the mountain monastery already convinced he had little left to learn there, and it took a single cup of tea, poured slowly and deliberately past its brim, to show him exactly how wrong he was. Jinhai had spent the better part of his 24 years distinguishing himself as one of the most promising scholars of his generation. He had memorized the classical texts by the age of 16, debated and defeated older students twice his age at the regional academy, and earned, through genuine and considerable effort, a reputation that preceded him wherever he traveled. He had come to the mountain monastery not because he doubted his own understanding, but because he'd heard stories of an old monk named Baoshan whose wisdom was spoken of with a kind of reverence Jinhai found, privately, a little difficult to credit. He had come, if he was honest with himself, less to learn from the old monk than to measure himself against him, to see whether this legendary wisdom could actually withstand the scrutiny of a mind as sharp and as thoroughly trained as his own. He arrived at the monastery in the late afternoon, having climbed the long mountain path since dawn, and was shown to a small, simple tea room where Baoshan received visitors. The old monk was smaller than Jinhai had expected, his robes plain, his manner unhurried in a way that struck the young scholar, in that first impression, as closer to simplicity than to any particular depth. "You've traveled a long way," Baoshan said, gesturing for Jinhai to sit across from him at the low table. "What brings a scholar of your reputation to an old monk's tea room?" Jinhai, settling onto the cushion across from him, found himself already composing the opening arguments of the conversation he'd been anticipating for weeks. "I've studied the classical texts extensively," he said, with a confidence that came easily to him after years of academic success. "I've read every major commentary on the sacred writings, debated the finer points of philosophy with the most respected scholars in 3 provinces, and I've come to understand, through years of rigorous study, most of what can reasonably be known about wisdom and virtue. I've heard a great deal about your own teachings, and I confess I've come partly out of curiosity, to see whether what I've heard matches what I already understand, or whether there might genuinely be something new for me to learn here." Baoshan listened to this with an expression that gave away very little, neither impressed nor dismissive, simply attentive in a way that made Jinhai, despite his confidence, feel very slightly, uncomfortably examined. "That's a great deal of knowledge to have gathered by so young an age," Baoshan said finally. "Before we discuss any of it, will you allow me to prepare you some tea? It's a long climb up this mountain, and you must be thirsty." Jinhai, pleased by what he took to be a gesture of hospitality appropriate to his visit, agreed readily. Baoshan lifted a plain ceramic cup, set it in front of Jinhai, and began to pour from a simple kettle that had been warming nearby. Jinhai watched, still composing his next argument in his mind, only half attending to the ordinary domestic ritual unfolding in front of him, until he noticed something that pulled his full attention back to the table. The old monk was still pouring, well past the point where the cup had already filled to its brim. "Master Baoshan," Jinhai said, an edge of confusion entering his voice, "the cup is full. It's overflowing onto the table." Baoshan continued pouring, unhurried, as tea spilled steadily over the cup's edge and pooled across the wooden table between them, dripping now toward the floor. "Master," Jinhai said again, more insistently this time, half rising from his cushion in genuine alarm at the mess spreading across the table. "The cup cannot hold any more. Anything you pour now is simply wasted." Only then did Baoshan set the kettle down, looking at Jinhai with an expression that held, for the first time since the conversation began, something close to real warmth. "You are exactly right," the old monk said. "The cup is full. It cannot receive a single drop more, no matter how carefully or how generously I continue to pour. Everything I add from this point forward simply spills away, wasted, contributing nothing at all to what the cup actually holds." He set the kettle aside entirely and looked directly at Jinhai. "Like this cup, you have arrived here already full of your own opinions, your own speculations, your years of accumulated certainty about what wisdom is and where its boundaries lie. How can I possibly show you anything new, when there is no room left in you to receive it? Before I can pour anything of value into a mind like yours, that mind must first learn how to become empty." Jinhai felt his face flush, caught between embarrassment at having been so plainly and elegantly outmaneuvered, and a flicker of his old, familiar defensiveness rising to meet the challenge. But surely, he said, a scholar's accumulated knowledge is valuable precisely because it fills the mind with understanding. You wouldn't ask a physician to forget everything he's learned about the body before treating a patient. Why should wisdom be any different? Isn't emptiness simply another word for ignorance? Bao Shan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured toward the overflowing cup, still sitting between them, tea now dripping steadily onto the floor. Tell me, he said, what would happen if I asked you to add a spoonful of honey to that cup right now, to sweeten it? Jin Hai considered the cup, already full to its absolute limit. There's no room. It would simply overflow further, without actually mixing into anything. The honey would be wasted as completely as the tea has been. And yet, Bao Shan said, if I had poured only half a cup, and then offered you honey, what would happen? It would dissolve properly. It would actually become part of what's in the cup, rather than simply spilling uselessly away. This is precisely the difference between the knowledge you've accumulated and the wisdom I might be able to offer you, if you were willing to make room for it, Bao Shan said. Your years of study are not without value, Jin Hai. I would never tell you to forget everything you've learned, any more than I'd tell that physician to forget the body's anatomy before treating a patient. But you have arrived here treating your existing knowledge as a cup already filled precisely to the correct level, requiring nothing further, ready only to be tested and confirmed rather than genuinely added to. And a mind that arrives already convinced it knows the correct level to stop at will find that anything truly new, offered to it, simply spills over the edge, unable to properly mix in, wasted in exactly the way that tea is now wasted on my floor. Jin Hai sat with this, some of his earlier confidence faltering slightly, though old habits of argument still pulled at him. But how does a person know the difference, he asked, between genuine wisdom worth making room for, and simply someone else's opinion, no more valid than my own carefully reasoned conclusions? If I empty myself of everything I've learned every time someone claims to have wisdom to offer me, how do I avoid becoming a cup that holds nothing at all, filled instead with whatever anyone happens to pour into me, valuable or worthless alike? Bao Shan nodded, as though this were exactly the right question, the kind he'd been hoping the young scholar might eventually arrive at. This is where most people who first hear this teaching misunderstand it, he said, and I don't fault you for reaching for the same misunderstanding, because it's a natural one. Emptying your cup does not mean discarding your own judgment entirely, or believing every claim poured toward you without discernment. A cup that holds nothing at all, accepting whatever is poured into it without any capacity to evaluate what it's actually receiving, is not wisdom either. It's simply a different kind of emptiness, one just as unhelpful as a cup too full to receive anything new. What I'm describing is something more specific than total emptiness. It's the willingness, when you sit down to actually listen to something, to set aside, for the length of that listening, your finished conclusions, not permanently, not uncritically, but long enough to genuinely hear what's being offered before deciding whether it belongs in your cup at all. You arrived at my table today already having decided, before I'd said a single word of actual teaching, what you expected to find here and what you already believed about it. That decision, made before the listening even began, is exactly what filled your cup past its brim, long before I ever lifted the kettle. I did arrive with expectations, Jin Hai admitted, more quietly now, the earlier flush of embarrassment settling into something closer to genuine reflection. I came here half expecting to test your teachings against my own, rather than to actually receive anything from you at all. Most people who consider themselves already learned arrive that way, Bao Shan said, without judgment. It is, in some ways, the natural consequence of years spent successfully accumulating knowledge and being rewarded for defending it well. You have been trained, very effectively, to argue your positions convincingly, to defend what you already believe against challenge, to demonstrate mastery rather than uncertainty. These are genuinely valuable skills, Jin Hai, I don't dismiss them. But they are the skills of a full cup, polished and complete, and they are of very little use in the moment when what's actually needed is the different skill of becoming empty enough to receive something you didn't already possess. He rose and fetched a cloth, wiping the spilled tea from the table with the same unhurried care he seemed to bring to everything, and then returned to his cushion, this time lifting an empty cup, a second one, which he set in front of Jin Hai in place of the overflowing first. Let me ask you something different now, Bao Shan said. Not a test of your existing knowledge, but a genuine question, one I don't already know the answer to myself, though I've turned it over many times across many years. Tell me, honestly, in all your years of study, all your debates and all your accumulated commentaries, has there ever been a single question you found yourself unable to fully resolve, no matter how thoroughly you studied it? Jinhai considered this seriously, surprising himself with how much more difficult it felt to answer honestly than the confident recitations he'd prepared on his climb up the mountain. Yes, he admitted slowly. There's a question about the nature of genuine virtue, whether it can exist without any awareness of itself, or whether the very act of recognizing one's own virtue somehow diminishes it. I've read a dozen commentaries on this question, and I've never found an answer that fully satisfied me. I've simply learned to argue both sides convincingly enough that most people assume I've resolved it, when in truth, I haven't. Now we have something to actually discuss, Baoshan said, and something in his tone shifted subtly, becoming less like a teacher delivering a lesson and more like two people genuinely turning a question over together. Not because I have some superior answer prepared and waiting to correct you, the way you perhaps expected when you first arrived here today. But because this is a question I have also sat with for many years, without ever finding a resolution I consider fully complete either. If you're willing to actually listen, not to defend your prior conclusions, and not simply to wait for your turn to demonstrate what you already know, but to genuinely receive whatever emerges between us, we might discover something together that neither of us could have found alone, each sitting inside our own already full cup. They talked long into the evening, and something in the conversation felt, to Jinhai, entirely different from every academic debate he'd participated in over the years. There was no clear winner being determined, no position being defended to the death against a determined opponent. Baoshan offered observations, and Jinhai found himself, for perhaps the first time in years, genuinely sitting with them rather than immediately searching for the counterargument that would let him reclaim the upper hand. Several times, he caught himself beginning to formulate a rebuttal before Baoshan had even finished speaking, the old, well-worn habit of a mind trained to argue rather than to listen, and each time, he noticed it happening, and deliberately set the impulse aside, choosing instead to actually hear the rest of what the old monk was offering before deciding what he thought of it. By the time the conversation finally wound down, well past dark, Jinhai hadn't arrived at any final, settled answer to the question of virtue and self-awareness that had eluded him for years. But something had genuinely shifted in how the question sat inside him. He no longer felt the old, familiar pressure to resolve it definitively, to arrive at a position he could defend confidently in his next academic debate. He found himself, instead, simply curious about it in a way that felt lighter and more spacious than the grinding, competitive curiosity that had driven most of his scholarly life up to that point. I came here today, he told Baoshan, as they finally rose from the low table, expecting to test whether your wisdom could withstand my scrutiny. I think I understand now that this was never actually the right question to be asking. I wasn't offering you anything to scrutinize. I was simply refusing to make room for anything you might have to offer me. Baoshan smiled, the same warm expression Jinhai had first glimpsed when he'd correctly identified the overflowing cup. You've understood, in a single evening, something that takes many people considerably longer to grasp, he said. That doesn't mean you should now empty yourself of everything you've learned and start over from nothing. Your years of study remain genuinely valuable, and I'd never ask a promising scholar to discard them. It simply means that going forward, before you sit down to truly listen to anyone, a teacher, a rival, a stranger with an unfamiliar view, you might ask yourself first whether your cup has room left in it, or whether you've already, without quite noticing, filled it to the brim with your own settled conclusions before the conversation has even properly begun. Jinhai remained at the monastery for several more days, and in each subsequent conversation with Baoshan, he found himself returning to the discipline the old monk had shown him that first evening, noticing the moment his mind reached for a rebuttal before it had finished actually listening, and gently, deliberately, setting that reach aside long enough to receive what was actually being offered. It wasn't easy. Years of trained argumentation didn't unwind in a matter of days, and he caught himself, more than once, slipping back into old patterns, defending a position out of habit rather than genuine conviction, simply because defending positions was the skill he'd spent his whole life perfecting. But something had genuinely opened in him that first evening beside the overflowing cup, and he carried it with him when he finally descended the mountain and returned to his studies. He noticed, in the months that followed, how much of his academic life had been organized around demonstrating a full cup to anyone willing to watch, how much energy he'd spent, for years, on appearing complete and settled in his understanding, rather than genuinely curious about what he might still be missing. He began approaching new texts and new conversations with scholars whose views differed sharply from his own, with a discipline he privately thought of, from that point forward, as emptying his cup first, setting aside, for the length of the listening, his finished conclusions, so that whatever was actually being offered had genuine room to be received before he decided what to make of it. Years later, when Jinhai had become a respected teacher in his own right, with students of his own who arrived, as he once had, already convinced they had little left to learn from him, he would occasionally offer them the very same lesson Baoshan had once shown him. He would sit a promising, confident young scholar down across a low table, lift a plain ceramic cup, and begin to pour, watching carefully for the exact moment his student's expression shifted from polite confusion to genuine alarm as the tea spilled steadily over the brim and across the table between them. "Master," they would inevitably say, exactly as he once had, "the cup is full. Anything more you pour is simply wasted." And Jinhai, setting the kettle aside, would look at them with the same warmth Baoshan had once shown him on a mountainside decades earlier. "You are exactly right," he would say. "Now tell me, how full is your own cup, before you've even heard a single word of what I actually have to teach you?"